Henry VI, Part 3, begins by dealing with the aftermath of the Battle of St. Albans, depicting the Duke of York in his moment of triumph and glory. And then it skips forward about the space of 5 years, historically, to show us the complete reversal of York's fortunes, as well as, by the end of the act, his eventual execution. And this is a play of reversals. That's the big theme of this play. We can picture the action that takes place in it as an actual wheel of fortune that constantly spins. One moment, it seems like Henry VI is on top. Then the next minute, he's on the bottom and York's on top. Then, before we can catch our breaths, York is on the bottom and somebody new is on the top. And this is in keeping with Shakespeare's general understanding of history as that of a cycle of action and reaction, justice and vengeance, never stopping. Any attempt to halt the cycle and to make peace is either hampered by some characters brooding over past events and plotting vengeance, or other characters thinking of potential triumphs for themselves, thinking they can still come out on top, and so they're not letting matters go. So nobody is ever secure in their power and in their safety for long. And that's actually one of the oldest lessons that history has to teach us, right? So if you've read the histories of the Persian Wars by the Greek writer Herodotus, there's a scene in there where Solon the lawgiver tells King Croesus that no man is happy until he's dead. Until then, he should only be considered lucky. Because to die on top is one thing, but as long as you're on top and still alive, well, there's always the chance that that wheel of fortune is going to spin just one more time and send you plummeting to the bottom. So that's one theme to note. Another theme is that this first act that you've read illustrates is that civil war is much more than just a contention between opposing parties or factions. It's a contention between even family members. There's no cohesive unit, even in the domestic life. Fathers are betrayed by sons. Sons are betrayed by fathers. Everyone is out for themselves. We see King Henry's family split apart in Act 1. By his efforts to make peace. And we see the Duke of York being goaded on by his sons when he tries to make peace. Half of the nobility, like Clifford, are trying to avenge their parents' deaths, while others, like young Richard, the future Duke of Gloucester, the Duke of York's son, he's plotting to usurp the rights of his brothers. His mind's on the future already. But to show the breaking apart and the collapse of a family, we first have to see them at their pinnacle. That's what makes these plays tragedies, right? We see somebody go from the top to the bottom. So Act 1 of this play begins with the Duke of York capturing the Parliament House with his entire family in tow, along with his allies. This is their moment of glory, their time to shine. Now, not only are his sons Edward and Richard with him, but we also know that historically the other sons would have been there as well. George, who afterward becomes the Duke of Clarence, and the youngest of the sons, Edmund, the Earl of Rutland. It's going to be important to remember these 4 sons of the Duke of York. The Marquess of Montague, who is actually an amalgam of several historical figures, but who claims to be York's brother, probably by marriage, he's introduced here as well. So this whole family of York storms in with Warwick and others, and everyone urges York to take what's his by right. York walks up onto a stage of some sort, a dais, at least that's how it would have been represented on stage, and he sits down on the royal throne, the seat reserved for what should be King Henry in the Parliament House. Then King Henry and his followers run in, and for a moment he actually seems more martial and king-like than he ever has before. He's flanked by men whose fathers have been killed by York's men. So there's Clifford, who we've already discussed. There's an Earl of Northumberland, who actually he's this would have been the grandson of Hotspur from Henry IV, Part 1, just in case you're curious about him. And so then these two sides get into this big legal debate about who is the rightful king. And at first, King Henry comes off strong. He says this: "Thinkest thou that I will leave my kingly throne wherein my grandsire and my father sat? No, first shall war unpeople this my realm, aye, and their colours, often born in France, and now in England to our heart's great sorrow, shall be my winding sheet. Why faint you, lords? My title's good, and better far than his." So, he's saying, I have a really good claim. My father was king. My grandfather was king. You all accepted me as king. Get out of my throne. I'm the king. Which, it's fair. He got it through lineal descent. But then, once York starts enumerating his ancestry, the mood shifts a bit. One of Henry's supporters, the Duke of Exeter, reluctantly admits that, okay, York has a claim too. And even Henry whispers to himself, I know my title's weak. He says that kind of in an undertone. So then Henry makes a decision that we can construe in two possible ways, I think. There's the more favorable way to construe it, and that is that he's trying to make peace without more bloodshed. And this would be in keeping with his character as we've come to know him so far. He might even see this as an act of self-sacrifice on his part, for the sake of preserving the safety of the realm and the lives of his subjects. So that's one way to look at what he does next. This sort of Christian nobility, this martyrdom, self-sacrifice, doing what's best for the realm. And then another way to look at it is that sheer cowardice and greed overpower him. And here's what he does. He tells York that if he can remain king so long as he lives, he'll name York as heir, disinheriting his young son Edward and the future Lancaster line in the process. And so with this decision, he immediately loses almost all of his followers. Clifford, Northumberland, and the others all wanted a fight. They want revenge for the deaths of their fathers, and even more than that, they've just sworn to be loyal to Henry before the entire Yorkist faction. And so now, how can they ever expect fair treatment in the event that Henry dies and York ends up ruling over them? So they all storm out of the room, feeling betrayed. They call Henry a faint-hearted and degenerate king, and an unnatural father, because he's disinherited his son. Only Exeter remains with Henry, because again, his conscience is telling him that York had a fair point too. So York and Warwick settle the matter with Henry. This was called the Act of Accord. York is appointed the Lord Protector of the realm, and he disbands his army and leaves. So we might imagine that at this point, Henry sits down and breathes a sigh of relief at the fact that all of this conflict is over. But then, in comes Margaret, red in the face and seething, and she's carrying their young son Edward along too. Remember that this is the Edward who was born a couple of years back that the last play was silent about. The one who may or may not have been the illegitimate child of Margaret and Somerset. But for all we know, it was the heir. It was Henry's heir and his son. So they come in, and then, in a more humorous moment, Exeter sees them coming, and he says, look at the time, I've got to go. And then Henry goes, oh yeah, I do too. And he tries to sneak out of the room with him, but Margaret sees him and she retains him. Then Henry, again with I think a bit of cowardice showing here, tries to say that it wasn't his fault, but that the Duke of York had forced him to make the agreement. Now we've just seen that wasn't true. Really, it was his idea. And in response to this, Margaret says, enforced thee? Art thou king, and wilt be forced? I shame to hear thee speak. Ah, timorous wretch! Thou hast undone thyself, thy son, and me, and given unto the house of York such head as thou shalt reign but by their sufferance. To entail him and his heirs unto the crown, what is it but to make thy sepulchre, and creep into it far before thy time? Warwick is chancellor and the lord of Calais. Stern Falconbridge commands the narrow seas. The duke is made protector of the realm, and yet shalt thou be safe? Such safety finds the trembling lamb environed with wolves. Had I been there, which am a silly woman, the soldiers should have tossed me on their pikes before I would have granted to that act. But thou preferrest thy life before thine honor. And seeing thou dost, I here divorce myself both from thy table, Henry, and thy bed, until that act of Parliament be repealed whereby my son is disinherited. The northern lords that have forsworn thy colours will follow mine, if once they see them spread, and spread they shall be, to thy foul disgrace, and utter ruin of the house of York. Thus do I leave thee. Come, son, let's away, our army is ready. Come, we'll after them. So, Margaret grabs their son, Edward, by the hand, storms off with him to take care of the problem herself. And Henry doesn't try to stop her. He says something to the effect of how it's natural for her to be angry, he understands, and that he just hopes that she doesn't get herself hurt in her wild schemes. Well, like I mentioned before, between this scene and the next one, about 5 years pass. And in those 5 years, Margaret has been going around raising support, mainly in Scotland and in other parts of the north. She's got Clifford, Northumberland, and some of the others who are all supporting her and her son's claim. And Henry is sitting on his throne in London, pretending like everything's resolved when it's clearly not. And the Duke of York, for his part, is living in peace at his home in Yorkshire, like he promised to do. And in scene 2, we see his sons and his brother arguing about how they can best persuade him to go back to war with Henry. And even though they do their best, he's initially reluctant to do this. He says, look, I made an agreement. I'll be king eventually, but I'm going to stand by my word here. I'm not going to fight Henry. But we can see that his sons are impatient. They don't want to wait around for Henry to die of old age. They want the prize now, which is exactly what Margaret feared from what we just read. And then one of the sons, Richard, he makes the case that oaths sworn are only of effect if they're made before a lawful magistrate. And since his father had made that oath to keep the peace before Henry, and Henry isn't the lawful king, therefore he's not really bound by that oath at all. So a very sophistical, equivocal line of argument, right? Not the most honest line of argument. Richard says this: an oath is of no moment, being not took before a true and lawful magistrate, that hath authority over him that swears. Henry had none, but did usurp the place. Then, seeing 'twas he that made you to depose, your oath, my lord, is vain and frivolous. Therefore, to arms. And father, do but think how sweet a thing it is to wear a crown, within whose circuit is Elysium, and all that poets feign of bliss and joy. Why do we linger thus? I cannot rest until the white rose that I wear be dyed, even in the lukewarm blood of Henry's heart. And this speech of his kind of seals the deal. York's old lust for the crown is reawakened, and he gives the command to gather his forces together. But before that can be done, messengers come up and say that Queen Margaret and her northern lords are marching on the castle. They've made the first move after all. One quick historical note, Margaret herself wasn't actually present at this battle. The forces were commanded by Clifford, Northumberland, and the new Duke of Somerset, who was the old Somerset's, the one that died in the last play. It was his younger brother. But Shakespeare wanted Margaret there for dramatic reasons that become obvious as the events unfold, and so she's leading the men. Under threat of having the castle besieged and possibly low on supplies, York doesn't wait for reinforcements to arrive from Warwick or anyone else, but leads his army out to confront the Lancaster men. And so begins the Battle of Wakefield. And it's a pretty one-sided battle. Nearly all of York's men are killed, and there were only a few Lancaster casualties overall. This was apparently a battle in which sheer overwhelming numbers of troops made all the difference. York was attacked on all sides, and despite his military experience, which we know that he had, and his strategic mind, which we also know that he had, he can't make any headway. During the battle, Rutland's tutor, his teacher, attempts to help him flee the castle, but they're caught. And then Rutland is brutally killed by Clifford. He makes some pleas before he dies, and his pleas are natural. He tells Clifford that he's an innocent child, that his quarrel is with his father, not with him. But we already know Clifford's mindset from the last play. He'd sworn then to harden his heart, to have no mercy on any of the Yorkist line, whether they be women or children. And so he kills the boy, finally getting revenge, or so he thinks, for the death of his father. And as the battle ends and the Yorkist army is scattered, Edward and Richard are driven off. York, the Duke of York, is captured by the enemy. Margaret, Clifford, and the others ride up and surround him, and at this point, we can imagine that he knows that his dreams of becoming king are over. He knows what's coming. He knows that there's going to be no mercy. So he resigns himself to his fate, and he starts taunting them for their cowardice and only fighting him when they have a multitude at their back. He actually tries to entice Clifford to single combat, and Clifford almost takes the bait, but then Margaret takes charge of the situation. And she's just relentlessly mocking him. A typical example of a sore winner, not a sore loser. She has him dragged over to an ash heap, a molehill, essentially, and put down on top of it. And she says, well, you wanted to be king of the mountain, so now you're king of a molehill. Then she has a paper crown put on his head to mock him, in a way that I think is pretty similar to how the Roman soldiers put a crown of thorns on Christ's head to mock him. And this is very fitting imagery for what Shakespeare's trying to say here. All throughout these plays, remember that we've heard talk about how the crown is a golden Elysium. Richard just said that. It's a treasure that all men secretly desire and that they want to grasp at. But then in the end, it's ephemeral. It's a hollow crown, according to Richard II. It's the worst of gold because it eats its bearer up, according to Henry V. And now, the Duke of York, even though he never actually wore it, realizes that he's been eaten up by his desire for it too. His dreams have been hollow, and in the end, they've amounted to nothing more than this mockery, this paper crown. But then the real insult comes. as if that's not bad enough. He's told that Rutland, his son, has been murdered, and then he just breaks down into tears. And then Margaret takes a handkerchief that's stained with Rutland's blood. She had had Clifford, I guess, wipe his bloody blade on it. And she gives it to York and she says, "There, wipe your tears with this." And this is really what breaks York. And as he's weeping, mourning, he says this to Margaret. "That face of his the hungry cannibals would not have touched, would not have stained with blood, but you are more inhuman, more inexorable, 10 times more than tigers of Hyrcania. See, ruthless queen, a hapless father's tears. This cloth thou dipst in blood of my sweet boy, and I with tears do wash the blood away. Keep thou the napkin, and go boast of this, and if thou tellest the heavy story right, upon my soul the hearers will shed tears. Yea, even my foes will shed fast-falling tears, and say, Alas, it was a piteous deed. There, take the crown, and with the crown my curse, and in thy need such comfort come to thee, as now I reap at thy too cruel hand. Hard-hearted Clifford, take me from the world, my soul to heaven, my blood upon your heads." So, at this moment, it seems like he's come up with a pretty fair estimation of Margaret's character. She's worse than cannibals. She's bloodthirsty and drunk on her own victory. And she's actually asking him, as he's saying this, to weep more, because the sight of his tears causes her to dance for joy. But remember that just a few scenes ago, it was York who was ascendant. And now look how quickly he's fallen. And Margaret is about to find out that wheel of fortune is about to spin again. It's actually already hinted at here in York's dying curse. He says, "For as cruel as you've been to me, I hope somebody else is just as cruel to you in the future." And so we can see already that this battle and York's death isn't going to resolve anything. It's just going to generate this new cycle of vengeance. His grieving before he's killed is enough to make one of the lords, Northumberland, regret what they're doing. But Clifford and Margaret are both stern characters, and they both stab him. Not Northumberland, the Duke of York. And Margaret gives orders that his head is to be put up on the gates of the town of York, so that York can overlook York. So there's more severed heads coming into play, just like in the last play. Other casualties in this battle that the play doesn't have time to tell us about are the Lord Salisbury, who we've met. He was Warwick's father. And Sir Thomas Neville, who was Warwick's brother. So you can imagine that the sons of York who escaped and Warwick are all going to be very wrathful and seeking revenge after news gets back to them of what's happened. In next week's readings, Acts 2 and 3, we'll cover other important battles of the War of the Roses, including the Second Battle of St. Albans and the Battle of Towton, which is often said to be the largest and bloodiest battle ever fought on English soil, although the claim is debated by some. Nevertheless, we'll cover those battles and other things in next week's readings. Thanks for watching.